Elizabeth Van Lew was one of the most daring and important Union spies in the American Civil War, and one of the bravest women in American history. She was one of the first landowners to free all her slaves, and then use them as spies and informants behind Confederate lines. She was so successful that the information she passed on to the Union generals is believed to be a contributing factor to them winning this brutal war. This is the story of Elizabeth Van Lew, a spy master behind enemy lines.
I don't think there's ever been a more effective spy than Elizabeth Van Lew. Even more so when you remember what she achieved was behind enemy lines, right in the very heart of the enemy.
What she did was astonishing, fueled by her humanity and by her passionate belief that things had to get better for the United States.
In later years, Grant actually said that the information that came from Richmond via Van Lew and Mary was the best information that he received anywhere, and she was a kingpin in them winning the war.
She was ballsy. I mean, let's face it, she may have had the body of a feeble woman, but she'd got the mind and the balls of a man.
Elizabeth Van Lew was born in 1818 in Richmond, Virginia. Her father had a successful hardware business, which made her family one of the most prominent in the area. She had a Quaker education, which instilled in her a strong belief that slavery was wrong and should be abolished. When her father died in 1843, she convinced her mother to free all their slaves. And with the money she inherited, about $200,000 in today's currency, she set about buying and freeing their relatives too.
Elizabeth was educated in Philadelphia by Quakers, and she, from a very early age, was totally anti-slavery. So as soon as father died, they gave all of their slaves freedom and employed them, and went on to buy slaves that were being sold so that they could keep the families together. So, of course, she used these slaves as part of her spy network, because they were extremely grateful to her for what she'd done for them.
She was very much on the side of the abolitionists, on the side of the United States, the Union, against the Confederates. She was fueled by her moral certainties as a Quaker. She, for example, she would free slaves and then pay for them to have proper education. She would pay for slaves to learn how to be really good servants, and then she would employ them or make sure they got employment.
When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, she found herself in a minority of one, a passionate Unionist and Abolitionist living in a Confederate town. But far from that curtailing her views, she decided to use it to great effect. She rallied the slaves and families that she had freed and slowly built up a basic but effective spy and intelligence network for the Union Army behind enemy lines.
Here's a single woman living in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, and she's a Union sympathizer. I cannot believe that she wasn't murdered. I cannot believe her house wasn't burned down. And not only that, but she was openly telling everybody that she believed in the Union and she was totally against slavery. The woman was beyond belief.
Now, what does Old Mill Pond mean to you, Molly?
Old Mill Pond? Mm-hmm. Well, that's down by the Thomases, isn't it?
Exactly so. Now, that is going to be one of the places where we meet up with the Union soldiers when they've escaped from Libby prison.
at the death of her father, that's really where her spying network and her spy story starts, in a desire to free the slaves that are left to her in the will and to make everybody equal. She doesn't believe that people should own other people. And she starts off on a one-woman campaign, basically, to free every slave she possibly can. And she uses a huge amount of her money buying up the families of the slaves she's already freed so that she can free all the families and send them north.
She ran her own spy network, which was actually quite astonishing, not just because she was a woman, although that's pretty remarkable, but because she did it with such extraordinary thoroughness and with a little cocking the snook at the enemy.
Now listen up, ladies. This is real important. I have here our Lord's Bible, and it is the exact same kind of Bible they have over at Libby prison where the Union soldiers are being kept. And here is a piece of paper where I have cut out little pinprick-sized holes. And this piece of paper is going to allow me to use this to send messages to the Union soldiers over at Libby prison. Send secret messages.
One of Van Lew's first missions was to help the Union prisoners being held in Libby prison in Richmond. She got permission to bring them food and other comforts, but secretly hid lockpicks, knives and maps in their food tins and blankets, right under the noses of the guards. With this, many of the soldiers were able to escape and make their way back to the Union camps.
Basically, she used to free Union soldiers from Libby prison, which was a huge warehouse that was turned into a prison. And she gained entry into there. She used to take food to them. She used to take clothing, medical equipment for them as well. She would have maps actually stitched into blankets, which were given to prisoners, picks and keys for them to be able to get out of their prison cells and escape. And then, of course, where do they go then? Of course, there were obviously lots of slave families around, and they would be passed from one safe house to another until eventually they were taken back to Union territory, for want of a better word.
They need to know to look out for 2 Chronicles, verse 29 and 30. When they have that, they can lay this piece of paper over at top, using this page number there as a reference point. And then each of these little holes I have pricked out reveals a letter. And if you transcribe each letter in order, N, D, mill pond. You see, it begins to make sense. Now, what is mill pond?
Van Lew was very fortunate. Going backwards and forwards into the prison, she could smuggle things in and out quite easily. She lived in a period where female dresses were huge. I mean, absolutely. It was like walking around in a tent. You could have concealed a horse, possibly, and got into the prison. She hid knives in jam jars. She had a custard tin made with a secret compartment. The heels of her shoes had things inside them there. She would smuggle in maps. There were books which she would pinprick messages into the pages so that even if the books were examined, no notes would fall out or anything like that. So she was always smuggling things in and out. She'd had a seamstress sew huge amounts of secret compartments into her dress where messages would come and go and bits of information. And she would smuggle food in. But the important thing, she took escape kits, basically, and maps telling people, when you escape, go to this house. This is a safe house, and they'll send you on to this house. I mean, she even took some of them and hid them in her own attic.
The stitching is a little loose, sir.
Historical reenactor Mark Griffin has studied the life of Elizabeth Van Lew and has put together some of the items that she used to smuggle into the prison.
Elizabeth Van Lew was a southern plantation owner living in Richmond, Virginia, but she was also a Union spy working well behind Confederate lines, which meant any of her spying had to be done very carefully as her life was in danger. The few years before the American Civil War, she'd been releasing some of her slaves, and so she created a network of intelligence and also safe houses right the way from the southern states to the north, and she was using that to free prisoners.
Mr. Heller. And how are you this fine day?
Morning, Miss Van Lew. I'm fine.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, sir. Now, I have here a little charity to distribute to these Union wretches. I trust that you will not hinder me in this, sir.
Damn wretches don't deserve it, ma'am.
Now, you mind your mouth in front of a lady, Mr. Heller. But they are God's children, and we must not forget that.
You say so, ma'am.
I do, and so does God, Mr. Heller.
Now, in Richmond was Libby Prison, one of the largest prisons in the American Civil War. And using her charitable works of taking useful things to the prisoners, she was able to smuggle in what we would now call an escape and evasion kit. Take, for example, this soldier's boot. If you know where to look, peeling the heel back, you've actually got quite a useful little lockpick, so you can get out of your cell. Now, if you did come across a guard who was putting up a bit of resistance, then why not use the reasonably recently invented tin can to hide something useful in? So inside our tin of strawberry jam here, we have a little pocket knife, incredibly useful. Now, once you've escaped, you're still in enemy territory, so you've got to know where exactly are your friends. Well, Elizabeth Van Lew would take a blanket, and inside the seams of the blanket was a map. Now, that map would show not only roads and railway lines, but most importantly, a network of friendly farmsteads. Farmsteads that were now owned by the very slaves that Elizabeth Van Lew had freed in those years before the American Civil War. And using ingenuity and a network of freed slaves, Elizabeth Van Lew was able to free dozens of Union soldiers.
You, the animal in the corner, you come over here. I have not forgot you, sir. I have a blanket for you, and it's a little old. The stitching is a little loose right here, but it will serve to keep you warm. While I hopes to be charitable to all of God's creatures. And God willing, this will all be over soon, and maybe I shall see you gentlemen real soon.
Elizabeth was brilliant at concealing key, useful objects that prisoners could use to escape. For example, she would smuggle in a blanket. Well, she didn't have to smuggle it. She would take it in. Look, I've got a blanket for the prisoner. Oh, great. And it would have a map concealed in it. There would be a hairpin in the heel of her shoe, and a blade hidden in a tin, a custard tin. And, you know, they had all these things, and when it was dark, they would use them to get out, to overpower their prison guards, which weren't terribly bright and probably drunk, but nevertheless, and they'd get out. And one of the very useful things that came of her, the practical useful things that came of her freeing so many slaves, was that she had this whole network of safe houses for the escaped prisoners to go and stay, belonging to the former slaves. So they would be able to go and stay in Betsy's house, and then in Tom's house, and then, you know, gradually and moving along in darkness, so they were safe the whole time until they got back to the Union country.
In 1863, Van Lew helped 2 Union soldiers escape from prison and get back through enemy lines. Back at their camp, they told General Benjamin Butler what she had done, right under the noses of the Confederate jailer. And he promptly dispatched a courier to recruit her as an officially recognized Union agent. She was instructed to send any information she gathered in coded dispatches, and taught how to write her messages in a colorless ink, which would only become invisible after it was held up to a flame.
She was so successful that General Grant actually made her, for want of a better word, an official Union spy. And he actually gave her her very own code name, Babcock.
The recognition Van Lew received from the highest command in the Union Army is hardly surprising. She established a highly effective intelligence network behind enemy lines that provided information on military tactics and logistics, as well as helping dozens of prisoners escape. It was a vital resource for the Union Army. Dr. Michael Goodman is an expert in military history and understands the importance of Van Lew's role in the American Civil War.
The key, of course, is not only to have someone operating behind enemy lines, working surreptitiously on your behalf, to which no one knows, but also having the means by which that information can be securely transmitted back to your own side. And having someone in enemy lines gives you a great advantage, depending on where they're placed. Often, in an ideal situation, they'll be placed within the high command of a military force, and you'll be able to know hands-on what is being planned at a strategic level.
In fact, Elizabeth's network was so efficient that she was incredibly proud that on a daily basis, she was able to smuggle out written material, fresh flowers from her own garden, and the local newspaper.
Remember that she was she was a resident in enemy territory, in the capital, Richmond, and she couldn't just write notes and send them into the prison, or write notes and send them to the Union Army. She used something that was as old as the Bible, invisible ink, which she wrote messages to, sent them into Libby prison, and all the guys needed to do when they were in there was use a candle and heat up the back of the paper, and the messages came out.
Now, Mary, there's something else I want to show you, which will allow us to write to one another in secret. It's called invisible ink. Now, all I do is I take this here old lemon and I squeeze the juice into the bowl. And I can use this old quill here just to write like I would normally do. Can you see anything?
I don't see nothing, Miss Van Lew.
No? Well, that has to dry, but here is one that I made earlier. Now, what you do, you take the paper and you hold it up to that flame there, almost scorch it, and don't let it burn. But when it almost scorches, as it browns, you should see the words come up.
I can see a letter.
That's how it works. There we go.
By June 1864, Van Lew's spy network had grown to more than a dozen people, an informal network of men and women, black and white, including her former servant, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who she had sent north to get a private education. At Van Lew's request, Mary Bowser returned to Richmond and was able to obtain a position as a dining room servant in the household of the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. She reported directly to Van Lew all the information she overheard while serving dinner.
The White House of the Confederates was in Richmond. That was where all the decisions were being made. And the woman of the house was pregnant and desperately needed more help in the house. So Elizabeth Van Lew said, well, I've got this slave. She's not great. She's illiterate. She's a bit not great in the kitchen, but she'll help. So she loaned the slave to her. Now, this is Mary. Mary comes in. She can read and write. She's very intelligent, but more importantly, she's got a photographic memory.
Elizabeth actually got Mary a job in the Confederate White House, the home of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and she became a dining room servant. And goodness only knows how much information she gleaned from that.
Well, it seems to me that the only thing we can do is bring our big guns back from the front. We're gonna need those, and withdraw to Petersburg and dig in. What are your opinions, Jim?
We need those guns.
We can't lose those. If we lose the guns, then it's all over for us.
For a spy master, who you want to recruit is ideally the highest placed source, the person who's going to make all of the decisions. But of course, that's very rarely the case. And so often what they're faced with are people at the other end of the spectrum, the most mundane people, the cooks, the chefs, the cleaners. And these people can be just as important sometimes as those who are making the decisions themselves, because they will not be noticed, they will not be observed, yet they'll be able to absorb everything which is being said in their presence.
Of course, the president and his family and his staff didn't think anything of this, this modest black woman who served them at dinner and went around with the drinks while they were discussing their plans and their strategies, because for a start they thought she couldn't read and write. How wrong they were because, in fact, Mary Bowser had a photographic memory.
Just imagine the scene. We're in Jefferson Davis's house, the president's house. There are 6, 8 generals all having dinner, all discussing tactics, troop movements, everything under the sun that is military. And serving the soup, the Union spy, Mary Bowser. Later on, a map was unfurled, and she would be able to pinpoint everything that had been said and discussed at dinner that night.
We've lost our eyes and ears, gentlemen. Since we lost Jeb Stuart, we're running scared most of the time. They're chasing us, they're kicking our behinds, and we're running, boys. With the guns, we're okay, but we're gonna have to, and I repeat, we will have to get our eyes and ears back. But that's gonna have to be secondary. We can't feed our men, then there's no point.
Of course, there would be many other meetings, more informal. There would be dinners where all the generals got together and discussed strategies and passed maps around and information, where Mary, handing round the potatoes and the port, would be earwigging and basically send all the information on to Elizabeth, who would make use of it and send it straight to Union headquarters.
So good to see you, Mary. So what's been going on at the White House?
There was 6 generals, Miss Van Lew. There was talking about soldiers and battles and such. I heard one say that there was supply problems outside Richmond and that Grant was getting real close.
How close?
Real close, they said.
Mary Bowser's photographic memory was a very useful asset for a Union spy inside the Confederate White House. Ian Rowland is a well-known mentalist and has taught FBI agents mind control techniques. He says that anyone, especially someone as bright as Mary Bowser, can easily be taught to develop their powers of memory. It's a system called mnemonics.
There's a lot of overlap between something that a spy might want to do and something that a mentalist might want to do, and so there's going to be some overlap regarding the techniques that they would use. One term you often hear is that of a photographic memory, and that's a bit of a misnomer. I don't really think that's a real thing, but certain people do have what we call an eidetic memory, whereby they can look at things and they remember objects and items and configurations based on their physical location. It's a sort of a spatial memory. You can go into some workman's workshop sometimes and it looks like a terrible mess with 1,000 different tools everywhere, but he knows in his mind exactly where each one is. So there are things like that. Most people will sometimes say, oh, I have a terrible memory. Nobody has a bad memory. They simply have an untrained memory. And there are things that anyone can learn. It doesn't matter about your intelligence or education. Anyone can learn to improve your memory, to be able to recall the things you really want to faultlessly. These are techniques that have been around for a very long time, since at least the ancient Greeks, and they can be taught and trained to anybody. In fact, that's part of what I do, not just training FBI agents, police officers, interrogation officers, and so forth. You know, I can't turn people into superheroes and give them telepathic gifts. Wish I could, that would be good. But I can take them as close as possible to that and teach them techniques that work in real life and bring you as close as possible to genuine mind reading.
Ian agreed to show some of the techniques he uses to enhance people's memories with a member of the public. To start, he's written down a list of random words. He then creates a striking image for each word and slowly links all the images together in a story.
First item here is a cat.
Okay.
So we need a silly association. Let's make it a really big cat, a heavy cat. Let's drop it. Hits the sofa, goes through the sofa, explodes the sofa everywhere. We've now got a nice, strong association. Take a moment, close your eyes. Just see that silly cartoon image, the big, heavy cat, straight through the sofa. Okay, with your eyes still closed, what's your first station?
Sofa.
And what's the item associated?
A cat.
Good, you can open your eyes. That's the first one done.
Okay.
And you will not forget that, I promise. Item number 2, a rainbow.
Okay.
So let's make it a solid rainbow, not a real one. So it's made of wood or metal or something. Let's stab it through the door. So you've got this 7 colours. bashing through the door, exploding, splintering in a riot of colour, leaving shards and shrapnels of colour all over the door. Okay? See it?
Yeah.
In your mind? Close your eyes. See that picture? Third item is a train. Let's make it a small train. Let's shrink it down, because you've got the power to do anything in your mind. Open the fridge door, put it in, watch the train get cold, covered in ice, covered in something like a prop from Frozen, you know, and it can't go anywhere. It's trying to go somewhere, but it can't because it's frozen. Yeah? You got that in your mind? Can you see it?
Yeah.
What's your third station?
It's the fridge.
Good. And what's the item associated?
Train.
What's your second station?
The door.
Having gone through the rest of the list in the same fashion, it was now time to put her photographic memory to the test.
Just the items, not the stations, starting at number 1.
Cat. Rainbow.
Yeah.
Train.
Yes.
Dentist. Bucket. Sandwich. Gold crown. Bottle. Kettle. And hammock. Wow. Really impressed. Wow. Wow.
I think it would be very useful for any spy to have a good memory. A good memory is not necessarily a photographic memory, but any sort of good memory. Memory can be improved. And I'm sure there's been all sorts of psychological tests on improving our photographic memories as well as our ordinary memories. But, for example, I went through a phase in life where I determined that I would remember all telephone numbers. This was just for my own convenience. So if someone gave me their telephone number, I would repeat it aloud to them, and thereafter I did remember it. Of course, I've forgotten them all now.
Ian agreed to demonstrate another of his photographic memory skills. Our volunteer has been asked to bring 2 books from home and then choose a page number, a specific line, and an exact word on that line from one of the books. Ian has memorized both books, well enough to be able, he hopes, to identify that specific word.
So far, you haven't revealed any of these details. I do know that you used this book. This is the book you used, didn't you? Okay. And this is the toughest one, because as you can see, it's the biggest one. Can you remember which page you went to?
Yeah.
What was the page number?
350.
The line you counted down to was?
Line 18.
18, 1, 8, cow and a rainbow goes into... And you counted along that line to how many words?
7.
Okay, so repeat those details for me. Page?
350.
350, which is a nice round number. I should have that in the index. Line was 18.
18.
And 7.
Exactly.
Okay, so 350, we convert that. He goes in, takes this round. This means something, but it will sound nonsense. Cow, rainbow takes back 3, drop what was down. It's one of 2 things. And you remember the word you looked at?
Yeah.
Around there's a reference to there's a reference to one of those. But if it was the 7th, we should be close to this. So that shouldn't really be too relevant. What was the word you looked at?
Should I tell you now?
Yeah.
Taking.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks so much indeed. It's great. Thank you. Well, anyone can learn to do it. Thank you.
Blacks were second-class citizens, were lower-class people, and nobody in their wildest dreams thought that a Negro servant would have the intelligence to be able to understand what these generals were saying. And because of that, the whole thing worked to such an extent that it probably helped the Union to win the war.
As the war progressed and suspicions about Van Lew's role as a Union spy increased, she found herself being followed around Richmond by Confederate agents. To give them the slip, she used another one of her spycraft tricks: disguise. She created a character called Crazy Bet to move around town and meet her contacts.
So, Molly, you take that.
She was also a master of disguise, and she actually went round Richmond, making out that she was not altogether there, to be quite honest with you. A head on one side, talking to herself as she was going along. And, of course, this was all part of the act. No one would take Crazy Bet, as they called her, seriously.
She lived right in the heart of the Edeby. She's in the capital of the Confederates, so she is in the worst possible place you can be if you are working for the opposition. If she'd been caught at any point, the likelihood is she would have been killed. She would have been executed for it. Certainly any one of the slaves, they knew full well they would have been caught and killed as well. But they were perfectly willing to work for her because they knew they were working for the greater good.
Elizabeth distinguished herself by being extraordinarily intelligent about how she presented herself to the locals. I mean, she was in this passionately southern Confederate town, and she was operating basically as a spy in their midst. Inevitably, there would be some hints and clues that she was operating as a spy, but she managed to cover it up pretty largely by adopting a kind of bonkers alter ego, who she would sort of go around muttering and looking sort of wild-eyed, and earned herself the nickname of Crazy Bet, which seemed to work.
She was in an area where it was very, very dangerous to do what she did. Now, she could get away with being an eccentric woman that was spending her money on frivolous things here, there, and everywhere. So freeing slaves, it was almost like saying she's a bit touched in the head. She's buying slaves and giving them away. She also spouted a lot of religious fervour that she got from a sort of a Quaker upbringing and so on. And she would go around muttering to herself, and she developed a twitch as well, so that if anybody questioned her, they go, "What, you mean that mad woman over there? She's not capable of doing that." In a very male-driven society, being a woman meant you were invisible. But being a mad woman meant not only are you invisible, you're stupid. There's no possible way you could be doing what you're doing.
As well as running a successful spy network, Van Lew also showed huge courage and bravery. When an attempt to free soldiers from Richmond's prison failed, based on information given by Van Lew, the leader of the raid, a Union colonel, was killed. The Confederate soldiers put his body on display at the railroad depot as a warning to others. He had already lost one leg earlier in the war, but he was propped up, minus his wooden leg and the little finger on his left hand. Needless to say, Van Lew was disgusted by the mutilation of his body and was determined that this brave young man would have some dignity.
She was a gutsy woman. She wasn't only just involved in the espionage side of it, she was rescuing soldiers, getting them released from the prison, and she even went out onto the battlefield and with a couple of slaves and actually dug up the body that was in a very shallow grave of a Union colonel, and actually brought his body back and gave it a decent burial in Richmond.
You're one of them. You did that to him. You mocked and desecrated his corpse. If that was your husband, would you have allowed that to happen to him? Shame on you. Where's your humanity? But then you are slavers, so I know that you have no humanity. Shame on you. Just because he was a Union soldier doesn't mean that you should forget he was a Christian man and treat him as one. Shame on you. Shame on you.
As Union troops advanced on Richmond towards the end of the war, Van Lew was not afraid to let all and sundry know about her Union support. Early in the morning of April the 3rd, 1865, she raised the Stars and Stripes above her home, the first Union flag to be raised in the South. This was going too far for the crowd in the streets, and a mob soon threatened to burn down the house. But Van Lew stood, defiantly, on the balcony.
Just imagine this scene. Elizabeth has actually got, hidden away, a Union flag in the house. And as the Union troops are approaching Richmond, Richmond is, to a certain extent, burning. There are angry, terrified Confederate sympathisers, hundreds, thousands of them, in the city. And she has the audacity to raise the Union flag above her house. And then, of course, the angry, terrified mob comes to the house. The hated Union flag's flying from the top of her house, and they're gonna burn her. She's a witch, and she actually comes out of the house, and she's going to attack them. And the only way that she actually survives is the fact that Mary Bowser actually comes out and drags her back in. And I still can't believe that they did not set fire to her house and kill her. She was a very lucky woman.
As the Union armies approached her town, the war was obviously coming to an end, but that didn't stop her being surrounded by Confederates, by the enemy. But she did something astonishing. She actually flew the Union flag, the US flag, in the middle of enemy territory. It must have been extraordinary for her to do that, in a kind of ecstasy of doing it, and she could not have known that she would survive that. I mean, obviously, everybody around her just thought, what is this? How dare she? But it just is a measure of the woman. She was uncompromising.
After a long, exhausting campaign, Union General Ulysses S. Grant finally captured Richmond in April 1865. Van Lew's work as a spy master was done. And although she received the grateful thanks of Grant and other officers, as well as a small payment for her effort, her inheritance and her social standing were done. Her fellow Richmonders couldn't forgive her, and she was labeled a Union spy and traitor.
For all her astonishing bravery, she had to pay a terrible price because after the war, even though she was on the winning side, well, kind of especially because she was on the winning side where she was living, she became the focus for enormous hatred and smear campaigns. She was said to be insane, crazy bet. She was actually, to this day, she's talked of as being a traitor and a witch.
I mean, basically what she was doing was very similar to what the French resistance was doing in the Second World War. They were living in occupied territory with the Germans, the Gestapo, the SS all around them. And she was doing exactly the same thing because she was living in her house in, she never referred to it as, but enemy territory. And how she wasn't discovered, how they didn't find out, I really don't know.
Even today, it's a deeply conservative, Republican sort of community, and in those days, even more so. And what had she done? She'd freed slaves. She had rejoiced in freeing slaves, and she had been on the wrong side. So she paid a terrible price. She lived on in her long life, but died in relative poverty, shunned by enormous numbers of people from her own community.
What she managed to do is phenomenal, because if you were living in a country that you were at war with, basically, idealistically, you or your friends all were Confederates, your neighbours are all Confederates, so even when you win, you're in the worst possible situation you can be in, because you have been found out as a spy, you're the person who helped win the war, and your next door neighbour lost a son in that war, or your friend from over the road has gone and lost their father in that war, and you are to blame. You're in the worst possible place you can be.
In her final years, she found she had fewer and fewer friends, and little or no money left to survive. So she was given handouts from the families and relatives of soldiers that she had helped during the war. She died at her home in her beloved Richmond in 1900. It was the end of a remarkable life.
I consider Elizabeth Van Lew possibly to be one of the best spies you could ever get, partly because she was driven for altruistic reasons. I mean, it bankrupted her being a spy. It's not as if she went into it for the money, the fame, and all that kind of stuff. It was something that cost her everything. Her money, her house, everything she possibly owned, her friends, everything was gone by the end of her life. She's an amazing woman, driven by a desire for everybody to be equal.
Looking at Elizabeth's life and achievements in the context of other spy masters in history, such as Cecil or Walsingham, for example, I mean, it doesn't really compare. I mean, she's head and shoulders above them, sorry, but she is. I mean, those guys operated in cosseted surroundings, a palace, they had armies, they had a whole network of very highly placed spies, they had government funds, they had monarchs who listened to them and would give them everything they needed to combat the enemy. Whereas there was Elizabeth, a woman on her own, working in the middle of the enemy. What she did was astonishing, fueled by her humanity and by her passionate belief that things had to get better for the United States.
Her actual spying network were fantastic because they were right in the very, very heart of the actual enemy. She had spies literally sat next to the people making the decisions. I would say throughout history there has never been a spying network as effective as her. And Grant himself said, I got the best information from anybody was from you in Richmond.
I heard them say that a fresh cavalry unit was being moved up to the old Cherry River fort, and that they were moving their heavy cannons to the overlook at Potomac Point?
Potomac Point?
Potomac Point, yeah, that's right.
When you think of today, with millions and millions of pounds being spent on MI5 and the CIA, and the success, of course, that they have today, we are talking of ground roots over 100 years ago, where they set this whole damn thing up round the kitchen table. Nobody believed that a single woman, a landowner, and her few black slaves could achieve what she did. And she did equally as good a job, I think, as MI5 does today.
I have a piece of paper.
Throughout history, I don't think there has ever been a spy or spy network as effective as Elizabeth Van Lew's network. You've got to remember, she was in the very, very heart of the enemy. You've got a spy network in the very rooms where they're making the decisions to fight you. You could not possibly get a better, more effective spy than Elizabeth Van Lew.